Mr. Barthold, just to rewind the tape and slow it down a little bit, you mentioned small businesses currently facing a mandate, but I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Do small businesses currently face a federal mandate with respect to creating a retirement plan currently?
Mr. Arrington, under present law, the decision to create a retirement plan is entirely elective to the employer.
Okay, so
regardless of size.
Okay, all right. So does this bill create a new retirement plan mandate for small businesses? I think I heard the word must, which is the same as shall, which sounds like a federal mandate. So does this bill create a retirement plan mandate on small businesses?
This may seem like a fine distinction. It does not necessarily. What it requires is that the employer maintain a plan or facilitate an automatic enrollment system. Now, this can be achieved, for example, by establishing an automatic deposit into the employee's IRA.
Okay, so let me just make sure. I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me make sure I understand, because I don't want to play semantics. I just want a clear answer, and I know you're trying to give me one, but does this bill mandate that small businesses established by nature of having an automatic enrollment mandate that that they have some retirement plan or this IRA that you mentioned?
If the employer has to, as I noted, establish a plan or facilitate the automatic enrollment, such as I described through an IRA. If not, the employer would be subject to a penalty tax of basically $10 for each day in a non-compliance period for each qualified employee.
Okay. So if the federal government's telling the small business that they have to have this plan, a retirement plan or IRA, where there's an automatic enrollment, and if they don't facilitate that, as to use your words, then the federal government's going to fine them. And that amount is $5,000, you said?
No, $10 per day per employee.
Oh, I got you. Okay, and then
for a period of not more than 3 months.
Okay, so is the definition of a small business like many others, 50 employees or less, or is it 100 or less, or 500? What's the definition where you would exempt a small business on account of being too small in this bill context?
In this legislation, if an employer has no more than 5 employees receiving at least $5,000 in compensation as measured in the prior year, that employer is exempt.
5 employees.
Yes, sir.
$5,000. Okay. Did the Affordable Care Act include a small employer exemption from the employer mandate to provide health coverage? And what was the result for the number of employees under that ACA?
Yes, it did, Mr. Arrington. It was generally measured at 50 full-time equivalent employees. Okay.
The revenue cost of this subtitle B, I heard you tell Mr. Schweiker, is $47 billion. What was the revenue score associated with the Bipartisan Securing a Strong Retirement Act?
Just a moment. That we reported that estimate to the Congress in Joint Committee document JCX 2221. It had revenue losing provisions and revenue raising provisions. The net effect was a positive revenue raised of $158 million over the 10-year period. That's the net of approximately $27 billion in revenue losing provisions, offset by approximately $27 billion in revenue raising provisions.
Last question. Thanks everybody for your patience. It seems like the majority has left some important bipartisan retirement provisions on the cutting room floor, as we say. Does Subtitle B facilitate an employer match for student loan payments? A. B. Does Subtitle B cover hardship withdrawals for victims of domestic abuse? And C. Does Subtitle B include additional catch-up contributions for late career workers?
Mr. Arrington, I believe you're referring to some of the provisions that were in that earlier legislation
yes.
reported by the committee. And those three provisions are not duplicated or subsumed in the present legislation.
Last one, I promise. Mr. Chairman, can I just get this one last one in?
If it's more favorable than what you've been suggesting, yes.
Does Subtitle B offer a tax credit for employers that make military spouses eligible for planned benefits? And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for indulging.
Thanks.
Mr. Arrington, the legislation before you today does not include the provision that you just referenced from the prior legislation.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Are there any other questions about the amendment and the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Smith, I should come back to you, and then I'll come back to Mr. Estes.
Thank you. Just very briefly, Mr. Barthold, are individuals making $400,000 or less exempted from this provision?
Mr. Smith, the provision is an employer level provision. So the onus of facilitating the plan is on the employer. There is no exemption for employers other than that defined by size, new startup, and as I noted, existing grandfathered plans. Those employers are also generally exempt.
So a small business owner whose income comes through a small business, if their income is $400,000 or less, they would still be subject to this mandate and or tax.
Mr. Smith, as the business owner, if they otherwise are a business that would be subject to the requirements of this legislation, they would be subject to that tax if they did not come into compliance with providing the auto enrollment plan.
Would the president have the executive authority to exempt individuals making less than $400,000, as he has said his plans would include?
Well, the legislation provides facts and circumstances tests under which the Secretary of the Treasury may abate any penalties that may arise. But I don't. There's not specific provision in the legislation that would say any business owner below certain income levels that their business would be exempt.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Let me recognize Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Couple of questions. You mentioned that the ABLE accounts, although I didn't catch what you said was the impact on ABLE accounts.
Under present law savers credit, Mr. Estes, eligible savings for which a taxpayer may claim the savers credit under present law are contributions into qualified retirement plans or IRAs. The proposal before you in the chairman's mark would say that a contribution into an ABLE account would also make the taxpayer eligible for the savers credit. So it's an expansion of eligible savings vehicles.
Does that also apply for college savings programs under the 529 provision?
Not in the legislation before you, sir.
Okay, just bringing closure to one question. As Mr. Arrington was asking several questions, and they were tied around the mandates and what actually was required, but just make sure it's clear in my mind. So an employer is mandated if they have 5 employees or more that make $5,000 or more, the employer is mandated to pull out 6% of their income and put it into some qualified retirement account, whether they create it themselves or use somewhere else.
Let me refine your summary in two ways. It's 6 employers or more. If you're 5 or less, you're out. They're required to establish a plan or facilitate an auto enrollment plan. The default contribution of the employee for this elective salary reduction begins at 6%, but it is elective to the employee. Among the notice requirements under the legislation, the employer has to tell the employee, here's what we've got going on. Here's what the automatic default contribution from your salary will be. And the employee can affirmatively say, no, I do not want to do that.
Correct. The employee can opt out. However, the employer is mandated to start that process. And if the employee doesn't opt out, that is a mandate on the employer.
That's correct, sir.
Thank you.
And I would say, in reference to the gentleman's legitimate question, as we've worked through issues here, the most important thing we've done is to strengthen automatic enrollment. And we do provide a tax credit to the employer to set up the mechanism whereby the employee would have the opportunity to set aside prescribed numbers of dollars. The problem we have now in America with retirement savings is people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. And the work that this committee has done has been stunning in terms of its achievement, but we still have a ways to go. So I appreciate the gentleman's question. Now, I think we are prepared to proceed to allowing members to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rice?
Yeah, Mr. Barthold, can you describe for me the provision that requires, that mandates that part of the retirement savings be allocated to annuities?
Oh, yes, sir. It's one of the new requirements is that an auto enrollment retirement plan has to offer the employee an option to take as an annuity upon retirement up to 50% of the balance in the plan, and the annuity can be either on the employee's life or the employee and a designated survivor.
And does that apply to every employer and every employee?
It does not apply to grandfathered plans. So this would be for essentially for newly established plans.
So this provision says that the employer has to offer an annuity for up to half of the plan. So it's not a mandate. The employee doesn't have to take an annuity for half of his plan.
No, it would be again at the election of the employee.
Thank you, sir.
My additional guess is that credit unions and community bankers and life insurance agents and others will very much like to set up these plans. I think it'll be very helpful because a lot of professional advice will be available as well. Other questions as we proceed? Well, let's proceed to Mr. Smith. You